The boardroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. A dozen executives sat around the long mahogany table, waiting for the meeting to begin. Some shuffled through their papers, others checked their phones, but most stole glances at the empty seat at the head of the table. The CEO was late. That never happened. Then, the door creaked open. A man in a sharp gray suit walked in, not from the hallway, but from a side door that led directly to his private office. His usually well-groomed hair was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened. He looked around the room, his piercing gaze scanning each face before he finally took his seat. The silence deepened. Jonathan Carter, the CEO of Nexus Global, had spent the last 6 months living a double life. On the surface, he was a respected businessman, the head of one of the most influential logistics companies in the country. But in the shadows, he had been working undercover within his own empire. What he had discovered in those months had shaken him to his core. It had started with whispers, small inconsistencies in financial reports, unexplained shipments, and a sudden surge in high-value contracts with anonymous clients. But what seemed like minor corporate irregularities soon led to a chilling revelation. His company, the very organization he had built with his own hands, had been infiltrated, not by competitors, not by corrupt executives, but by a cartel. A ruthless, highly organized criminal network was using his company as a front for their illegal activities. And worse, they had been doing it for years, right under his nose. Jonathan's heart pounded as he looked at the people sitting across from him. How many of them knew? How many were involved? How many had been feeding him lies while smiling to his face? His mind flashed back to what he had seen the night before. Hidden shipments being moved under the cover of darkness. Coded conversations between employees he had trusted, and a secret ledger containing names, transactions, and locations. His company wasn't just compromised. It was deeply entangled in something dangerous. He took a deep breath and leaned forward. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady but cold, "I have something important to share." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. Jonathan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He placed it on the table, tapping it lightly with his fingers. "This," he continued, his eyes never leaving their faces, "is everything. I've found the truth about what's been happening under our noses." Someone coughed. A chair creaked. A bead of sweat rolled down the temple of the company's CFO. Jonathan let the silence drag, watching for any flicker of guilt, any nervous twitch. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the secret pressing down on everyone in the room. Then, he opened the folder, and what happened next would change the company forever. Jonathan flipped open the folder, his fingers steady, but his heart racing. Pages of documents, transaction logs, and surveillance photos stared back at him. He let the silence stretch, waiting to see who would break first. The board members shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward as if trying to make out the contents of the folder, while others kept their gazes fixed on the table, their expressions carefully controlled. "This," Jonathan finally said, tapping the papers, "is evidence that someone within this company has been working with outside forces to run operations that go far beyond logistics." His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. A murmur rippled through the room. Some exchanged uncertain glances. A few frowned, pretending to be confused. But Jonathan had spent the last 6 months studying these people, and he knew the difference between genuine shock and calculated silence. "I've spent months following the money," he continued, flipping to a page with financial records. "There are millions of dollars moving through shell companies, transactions disguised as legitimate business expenses. But they're not. They're funding something else, something that has nothing to do with our company's mission." His eyes scanned the room. The CFO, Mark Reynolds, had gone pale. The head of operations, Sylvia Carter, no relation, was tapping a pen against the table, Her usual confident demeanor slightly cracked. And then there was Daniel Lowe, the chief legal officer, who sat unnervingly still, his expression unreadable. Mark cleared his throat. "Jonathan, I don't understand. Are you saying someone inside the company is involved in illegal activity?" His voice was careful, as if walking on glass. Jonathan stared at him. "I'm saying this company has been compromised." Silence. Then Sylvia scoffed lightly. "Jonathan, with all due respect, this is a billion-dollar corporation. We have hundreds of contracts, thousands of employees. Money moves around all the time. If you're seeing irregularities, it could be accounting errors, not some conspiracy." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance. "I thought the same at first. That's why I didn't bring this up until I was sure. But I've seen things. Shipments being rerouted to unknown locations, employees paid off to look the other way. We have an entire network running behind the scenes." Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured. "If that's true, then we should involve law enforcement. If this is as serious as you say, we can't handle it internally." Jonathan nodded. "That was my first thought too." He let his words hang in the air before adding, "But then I realized this operation has been running for years, right here, right under our leadership, which means whoever is behind it is sitting in this room." The reaction was immediate. Mark pushed back his chair slightly. Sylvia's fingers tightened around her pen. Daniel's gaze darkened just a fraction. No one outright denied it. Jonathan closed the folder. "I'm not calling law enforcement yet because I need to know exactly how deep this goes. If I go to the authorities too soon, the people behind this will cover their tracks before we can stop them. So instead, I went undercover." This got their attention. A few eyebrows raised. Sylvia leaned in slightly. "Undercover?" she repeated. Jonathan nodded. "For 6 months, I worked in our warehouses. I went on delivery runs. I dug into accounts, checked shipments, followed paper trails that didn't make sense. I met people who never knew I was their boss. And what I found..." He exhaled slowly. "Let's just say it was worse than I imagined." The tension thickened. He could see the uncertainty in some faces. A few looked genuinely alarmed. Others, too calm. "I found entire shipments that were never recorded in our official systems. I found employees receiving extra payments for special handling of certain cargo. And I found coded messages between managers in different departments, coordinating movements that had nothing to do with our business." Mark shook his head. "This is insane. You're telling me people inside our company, our people, have been running a secret operation without us knowing?" Jonathan met his gaze. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Sylvia crossed her arms. "And what exactly do you think they're moving?" Jonathan hesitated. He had his suspicions, but he wasn't ready to say it outright. Something valuable. Something worth risking everything for. Daniel's voice was quiet but sharp. "Do you have names?" Jonathan held his gaze. "Some." Another silence. The weight of unspoken accusations filled the air. Then Mark scoffed. "This is absurd. If this is true, then someone must have been covering their tracks for years. There's no way something this big could happen without someone in upper management noticing." Jonathan's stare didn't waver. "Exactly." Mark blinked, realization dawning. Jonathan wasn't just talking about low-level employees. He was implying something bigger. Something involving people in high positions. A muscle twitched in Sylvia's jaw. Daniel remained unreadable. Jonathan leaned back. "I wanted to give this team a chance to come clean. To explain. Because right now, I still have control over how this unfolds. But if I don't get the truth, I'll have no choice but to take the next step." Sylvia sighed. "Jonathan, if what you're saying is true, then we're in danger. If you've been digging around, whoever is behind this might already know." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I didn't come to this meeting. Unprepared. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Daniel's face. Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen and placed it on the table, speaker facing up. A soft beep. Then, a voice crackled through the speaker. A recording. Static. Then, words. A hushed conversation between two people. A man's voice. "We move the next shipment Friday. Usual route." A woman's voice. "And Carter. He's asking too many questions. If he keeps pushing, we handle it." The boardroom was dead silent. Jonathan watched their reactions. Some were frozen, in shock. Others, still too calm. He let the recording play a few seconds longer before stopping it. Then, with a voice as cold as steel, he said, "Now, who wants to start explaining?" The room felt colder now. Jonathan watched as the weight of the recording settled over everyone. No one spoke. No one moved. For a moment, all he could hear was the soft hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. He could see it in their eyes. Some were genuinely shocked. Others were calculating their next move. He had spent months preparing for this moment. But now that he was here, he realized something chilling. The people in this room weren't just colleagues. Some of them were enemies. Mark was the first to break the silence. He shifted in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Jonathan, this is serious. If someone inside the company is planning..." He hesitated. "If they're willing to go this far, you could be in real danger." Jonathan's gaze stayed steady. "I know." Sylvia leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Her usual confidence was cracked, but she wasn't panicked. That was what made Jonathan wary. "Where did you get that recording?" she asked, her voice calm but probing. Jonathan knew this was a test. If he revealed too much, the people involved would find ways to cover their tracks. If he held back, they might take desperate action. He had to be careful. "Let's just say I've had help." Sylvia's eyes narrowed slightly. "From who?" Jonathan ignored the question. "That's not important. What matters is that I know what's happening now. And I know that some of you have known for a long time." Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this information, Jonathan?" Jonathan studied him. Daniel had always been the most composed person in the room, a man who thrived on strategy and control. But even he looked slightly uneasy now. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "That depends," he said simply. "If the people responsible come forward now, we can contain this. We can find a way to fix it before it destroys the company." He let his words settle. "But if I don't get the truth, I take everything I have straight to the authorities." A heavy pause filled the air. Then Sylvia exhaled sharply and shook her head. "You think whoever is behind this is just going to confess? Come on, Jonathan. If this has been going on for as long as you say, we're not dealing with amateurs. They've covered their tracks. They've made sure no one can prove anything." Jonathan didn't break eye contact. "They made one mistake," he said. "They let me get close enough to find them." Sylvia held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. That was enough to confirm Jonathan's suspicions. She wasn't entirely innocent in this. The question was, how much did she know? And how far was she willing to go to protect herself? Mark ran a hand through his hair, his nerves becoming more obvious. "Jonathan, if you have names, you need to tell us. We can't just sit here guessing." Jonathan almost laughed. "That's an interesting choice of words, Mark." He tilted his head. "Are you nervous because you want answers? Or because you're afraid your name might be on the list?" Mark's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Jonathan didn't respond. He had spent enough time watching these people to know that pressure made them reveal more than they intended. Right now, he needed them to keep talking. Daniel exhaled and leaned forward slightly. "Jonathan, let's assume you're right. Let's assume someone in this room is involved. What do you expect to happen next? You think they'll just sit back and wait for you to expose them? Jonathan met his gaze. No, he admitted. I expect them to fight back. A cold silence stretched between them. Jonathan tapped the folder in front of him. That's why I've made sure I'm not the only one who has this information. If anything happens to me, everything I've uncovered goes public. Daniel's expression didn't change, but Jonathan caught the slight tension in his shoulders. That was confirmation enough. Daniel understood the stakes now. Sylvia let out a slow breath. Jonathan, you're playing a dangerous game. Jonathan gave a small, humorless smile. I know. Then, before anyone could respond, the door to the boardroom suddenly opened. A woman stepped inside, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made the entire room straighten slightly. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. Rachel Monroe. She was the company's external legal advisor, but Jonathan had long suspected she was more than that. He had seen her name appear too many times in places it shouldn't. Contracts tied to shell companies. Approvals for shipments. That didn't exist. If there was anyone who knew how deep this went, it was her. Rachel closed the door behind her and gave a polite, unreadable smile. Apologies for the interruption, she said smoothly. But I think I should be part of this discussion. Jonathan didn't look away from her. Interesting timing. Rachel set her leather folder down on the table and took a seat. I hear you've been doing some digging, she said, her tone almost amused. And that you found troubling things. Jonathan didn't reply. He just watched her. Rachel clasped her hands together. Before we go any further, let me give you some advice, Jonathan. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Be very careful about what you do next. Jonathan felt the shift in the room. The power dynamics had changed. Rachel wasn't just here to listen. She was here to control the damage. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Is that a warning? Rachel tilted her head. It's a reminder. The tension in the air was thick, but Jonathan refused to back down. He had come too far. He had uncovered too much. This wasn't just about his company anymore. This was about survival.